I took the job because it was simple, and the pay was steady. A regional surveyor's assistant, mostly paperwork, occasional field measurements, filling in gaps left by a contractor who had retired mid-project. The town was called Hallen's Reach, though no one I met ever used the full name. They called it Hallen, or just the town, or nothing at all, the way people refer to the place they live as a given rather than a name. I arrived on a Tuesday in late September, around 3 in the afternoon. The drive-in was unremarkable. 2-lane road, fields on either side, a grain silo about a mile out, a small bridge over a creek with a weight limit sign, so faded I had to guess at the number. The town itself sat in a shallow depression in the land, not quite a valley, more like the earth had settled slightly there and decided to stay. From the last ridge before the descent, I could see the whole of it. A grid of maybe 12 streets running east to west, 8 or 9 running north to south, a water tower painted the color of old teeth, a brick school, a cemetery on the north edge, and a single main road cutting through the middle from one end to the other. That main road was called Ferris Street. I would learn its name quickly. Everyone said it often. The woman who rented me the room was named Dell. She was in her 60s, thin in the way people get from a lifetime of standing rather than exercise, and she ran a boarding house that used to be a funeral parlor. She mentioned this twice in the first 10 minutes, not as a joke, just as information. The room was on the second floor, clean, with a window that faced east, and it cost less than I had expected. Dell asked me how long I planned to stay. I told her 6 weeks, maybe 8. She nodded and wrote the number 8 on a piece of paper and put it under a magnet on her refrigerator. I never saw her change it. The first few days were exactly what I had been told they would be. I walked to the small municipal office on Ferris Street every morning at 8, picked up the day's assignments from a man named Corbin who wore the same brown cardigan every time I saw him, and then drove out to whatever property line or drainage easement needed checking. The work was dull and pleasant. Farmers were polite. A woman at the diner learned my coffee order by the 3rd morning. Children waited for a school bus at the corner of Ferris and Linden and did not stare at me more than children stare at any stranger. The town had a hardware store, a grocery, a small pharmacy, a bar called the Anchor that had no apparent connection to any body of water, 2 churches, and a post office with a bulletin board full of notices about lost dogs and tractor parts. It was, in every visible respect, a functioning rural town of perhaps 900 people. I noticed the first odd thing on the 4th night. I had been out late, not unusually late, maybe 9:15, walking back from the Anchor where I had nursed a single beer and listened to 2 men argue about a fence line. The bar was on Ferris, 4 blocks from Dell's boarding house, also on Ferris. I had walked the route in daylight several times. It was a straight shot, well lit, the kind of walk you can do without paying attention. What I noticed was that I was not alone, and also that everyone else walking was going the same direction as me, or the opposite direction. But all of them, every single person on the street, was on Ferris. None of them were crossing to a side street. None of them were turning off. There were perhaps 15 people visible between me and the boarding house, spread across those 4 blocks, and every one of them was moving along the main road. A woman with a small bag of groceries, a man in coveralls, 2 teenagers walking a dog, an older couple. They walked at different speeds. They were clearly going to different destinations, and yet the pattern of their movement was a single line, funneled along one axis, like iron filings aligned to a magnet. I stopped at the corner of Ferris and Birch and looked down Birch. It was a residential street, houses with porch lights on, a street light about halfway down the block, a parked truck. Nothing unusual, but no one was on it. not a person, not a cat, not a moving car. The houses had lights in their windows, so people were inside them. But no one was outside, and more importantly, no one was arriving or leaving. I watched for perhaps 2 minutes. In those 2 minutes, on Ferris behind me, I heard at least 3 separate conversations, a car passing, and the bell on the door of the pharmacy. On Birch, in front of me, there was nothing. Not silence exactly. The sound of the town was there, but muted, as if heard through a wall. I walked back to the boarding house on Ferris. I did not turn down Birch. I should say here that I am not someone who is easily unsettled. I have worked in enough small towns to know that every one of them has its own small strangeness, its local rules and unspoken habits. A town where people don't wave at outsiders. A town where the bar closes at 8 even though the sign says 10. A town where everyone goes to the same church even though there are 3. You learn these things and you don't ask about them, because asking makes you the kind of person who asks, and no one likes that person. So for the first week, I simply observed. The pattern held. During the day, the town used all of its streets normally. Children rode bicycles on the side streets. Delivery trucks used the alleys behind the shops. The mail carrier worked her route through every block. Old men sat on porches on Cypress and 9th and waved at me when I drove past on my way to a survey site. The town, in daylight, was a town. But around the time the sun finished setting, which in late September was roughly 7:15, something in the town's behavior shifted. It was not announced. There was no siren, no bell, no call. It was more like a collective decision that had been made long ago and was simply continued, the way a family continues a holiday tradition without discussion. By 7:30, the side streets were empty. Not just empty of foot traffic, which would have been normal in a small town at night, empty of everything. No dogs being walked, no kids skateboarding, no cars pulling in or out of driveways. The cars that had been parked on side streets during the day were, by 7, moved to Ferris, or to the small municipal lot behind the hardware store, which had an entrance on Ferris, or into enclosed garages. The side streets had lights on in the houses, and occasionally I could see a figure move behind a curtain, but the exterior of those streets, the public space of them, was abandoned. Ferris, by contrast, was lively. Not crowded, not like a city, but populated consistently. From the time the sun set until, I would later learn, about 4 in the morning. People walked on Ferris to go to the bar, to go to the one late opening diner, to go to the pharmacy which stayed open until 11, to visit neighbors who lived on Ferris, or simply to walk. There was a quality to the walking that I noticed only after several nights. People walked slowly on Ferris at night, not casually slow, deliberately slow, as if hurrying would have been a breach of etiquette, and they walked in the middle of the sidewalk, not near the edges. They did not cut corners. When they reached an intersection, they crossed Ferris if they needed to, but they did not turn down the cross street. If their destination was on a side street, they walked to the point on Ferris nearest to it, and then, and this is the part that took me time to see, they waited. They waited for what I eventually understood to be a specific condition, though I never learned what it was. Sometimes the wait was brief, a few seconds. Sometimes it was longer, 2 or 3 minutes. They stood at the corner, calmly, not looking around, not checking phones, just standing. And then, at some moment that was invisible to me, they would step off Ferris and walk quickly, not running, but briskly, down the side street to their house. Once inside, the porch light, if it had been on, would go off, and the side street would return to its empty state. I watched this happen dozens of times before I asked anyone about it. The person I asked was Corbin, the man in the brown cardigan at the municipal office. I chose him because he seemed the most officially positioned person I interacted with, and because he had a dry, unbothered manner that suggested he would give me a direct answer, or none at all, but not a lie dressed as an answer. I asked him on a Thursday morning while he was stamping a stack of forms. I said it casually. I said, "I've noticed that people here don't really use the side streets at night." He did not stop stamping. He said, "That's right." I waited. He continued stamping. After perhaps 10 seconds, he added, "We use Ferris after dark." I asked why. He looked up then, not sharply, just with the mild attention of a man confirming he had heard a question correctly. His expression was not guarded. It was not blank. It was something I have thought about many times since, and the closest I can come to describing it is that it was the expression of a person who has been asked to explain why water is wet. Not annoyed, not defensive, simply aware that the question has no available answer in the terms the asker is using. He said, "That's how it's done here." I said, "But why?" He said, "It works." And then he went back to stamping. I asked 2 more people over the following days, a waitress at the diner whose name was Janine, and an older man named Pete who ran the hardware store and had been friendly to me from the start. Both responded in essentially the same way as Corbin. Janine said, "Oh, we just stick to Ferris at night, you'll get used to it." When I pressed, she said, "It's nothing. It's just the way we do it." Pete said, "We've always done it this way." And when I asked how long always was, he said, "As long as I can remember." And his father remembered it too. He said this without discomfort. He then asked if I needed any particular gauge of wire. No one was hiding anything from me. That is what I want to be clear about. There was no conspiracy of silence, no exchanged glances, no hushing when I entered a room. The town's behavior around the rule was not secretive. It was simply total. The rule was so thoroughly integrated into daily life that asking about it was like asking someone why they breathed through their nose instead of their mouth. They could tell you they did, but they could not tell you why, because the why was not something they had ever needed. I began, during the second week, to test the edges of my own understanding. I did not break the rule. I want to be clear about that as well. Something in me, some small animal instinct that predated my curiosity, would not let me step off Ferris after dark. But I began to observe the boundary more closely. I would stand at the corner of Ferris and Maple, or Ferris and Oak, and I would look down the side streets for as long as I could stand to. The first thing I noticed was the light. During the day, the side streets were lit normally. At night, the street lights on the side streets were on, but the light they cast seemed to fall differently. I am not a physicist, and I do not want to make this sound more mysterious than it was. What I mean is that the cones of light beneath the street lamps on the side streets at night looked shorter than they should have. The light reached the ground, but it did not seem to spread. It pooled. And the darkness around the pools was not the gradual darkness you see on an unlit country road. It was abrupt, like a curtain. The second thing I noticed was the sound. I have already mentioned that the side streets were quieter than Ferris, but quieter is not quite accurate. The sound on Ferris at night was normal town sound. Voices, footsteps, the occasional car, a door closing somewhere, the hum of the diner's sign. When I stood at the corner and turned my head slightly, so that one ear was pointed down the side street and one was pointed along Ferris, I could hear both, and the side street was not silent. It had sound. But the sound on the side street did not match what I was seeing. I would hear, for example, footsteps on a side street where no one was walking, not loud, not threatening, just the clear rhythm of a person walking on pavement from somewhere I could not locate. I would hear, occasionally, the soft sound of a screen door opening and closing, when no door on any visible house was moving. Once I heard a child laugh, not nearby, not far. At a distance I could not place, because the sound seemed to come from a direction that the street did not extend in. The third thing I noticed took me longer, because it required me to compare what I was seeing at night with what I saw during the day. The side streets at night were not the same length as the side streets during the day. I will try to explain this carefully. Maple Street during the day ran from Ferris south for 4 blocks before ending at a T intersection with a road called Low Creek Road. I had driven it. I had walked it. I had measured a property line on it, 4 blocks, roughly a third of a mile. At night, standing at the corner of Ferris and Maple, looking south down Maple, I could not see Low Creek Road. I could not see the T intersection. I could see the first streetlight, and beyond it, vaguely, the second. Beyond that, the street continued into a distance that seemed substantially greater than a third of a mile. It was not foggy. The air was clear. The streetlights continued, receding, getting smaller, for what looked like half a mile. A mile more. I counted the lights once. During the day, I had counted 6 streetlights on Maple between Ferris and Low Creek. At night, standing at the corner, I counted, before I stopped counting, 14. I want to be precise about my emotional state when I noticed this. I was not afraid. I was puzzled. I considered seriously whether my depth perception was being tricked by the quality of the light, or whether the streetlights on Maple at night included some that I had missed during the day, perhaps because they were off or obscured. These were reasonable hypotheses. I did not dismiss them. I tested them carefully over several nights. They did not hold up. During the day, I walked Maple slowly, from Ferris to Low Creek, and counted every light pole, every utility pole, every structure that could conceivably hold a streetlight. 6 poles with lights, 4 additional poles without lights, just power lines. The total number of poles, lit or unlit, was 10. At night, the number of lit streetlights visible from the corner of Ferris and Maple, looking south, was never less than 12. I checked this on 5 different nights. The count varied: 12, 14, 13, 14, 15. The street at night was longer than the street during the day. I did not tell anyone. By the 3rd week, I had confirmed similar discrepancies on 4 other side streets. Oak Street, which during the day dead-ended at a small park after 3 blocks, appeared at night to continue past where the park should be, the streetlights receding into a distance that had no business existing. Birch Street, which I had first looked down on that 4th night, had during the day a curve about 2 blocks south where the road bent around a stand of old trees. At night, from Ferris, the curve was not visible. The street appeared straight and long, and the trees were not where the trees were. Cypress Street, which on the map and in daylight ran 6 blocks before ending at the cemetery on the north edge of town, appeared at night to not end at all. I stood at its corner with Ferris for nearly 10 minutes one night, looking north, and the streetlights simply continued into the dark, growing smaller, growing closer together the way a line of points does when it recedes to infinity. At no point could I see the cemetery gate. At no point could I see the line of pale stone that marked the cemetery's southern wall, which during the day was plainly visible from almost anywhere on the north half of Cypress. The 9th Street, which did not have a tree name but was simply called 9th, behaved differently. At night, it looked shorter than it should have. The streetlights, instead of receding, seemed crowded together, as if the street had been compressed, and the far end of it, where during the day I had seen a small machine shop, appeared to be only 2 blocks away instead of 5. This was the only street I noticed this on. It did not comfort me. During my 4th week, I began to pay closer attention to how the residents walked on Ferris at night, and how they entered their side streets. I realized that what I had taken for waiting at the corners was not passive. The residents were doing something at those corners. It was subtle, and I never saw any of them acknowledge it, but it was consistent. When a person reached the corner of Ferris and, say, Maple, needing to go home to a house on Maple, they would stop. They would stand for a few seconds facing the side street. And then, just before they stepped off Ferris, they would briefly turn their head, not fully, just a slight tilt, to the left and then to the right, as if listening. Then they would step off, walk briskly to their house, enter, and the porch light would go out. Not everyone did this exactly the same way. Some paused longer. Some did not tilt their heads, but instead closed their eyes for a moment. Dell, whom I observed one night returning from the grocery, simply stood at the corner of Ferris and Cypress for nearly a full minute, perfectly still, and then walked the block and a half to the boarding house at a measured pace that did not match her usual walk, which was brisk. When she came inside, she nodded at me as she always did, took off her coat, and went to the kitchen. I did not ask her about what I had seen. I understood around this time, though I had not yet articulated it to myself, that the rule was not about protecting the town from something on the side streets, or at least not in the way I had first assumed. The rule was about the street itself. Ferris, at night, was the only part of the town that was behaving correctly. The side streets were not empty because something dangerous was on them. They were empty because they were not, at night, fully there. They were somewhere else, or in some other shape, or some other length, and the residents had learned, at some point in the town's history, that no one now remembered, to not use them during the hours when they were unreliable. The residents walked on Ferris because Ferris stayed Ferris. I tested this hypothesis in one more way, and it is the thing I have thought about most since I left. I walked Ferris at night from end to end. The full length of it, from the west edge of town where it became the county road I had driven in on, to the east edge where it became a gravel road that led to a few outlying farms. This was a walk of about 1.25 miles. I did it on a Wednesday night, starting at 8:10 in clear weather, with a flashlight I did not need because Ferris was well lit. During the walk, I counted the cross streets, 21 of them. This matched what the map showed and what I had counted during the day. I walked back, east to west, and counted again. 21. I walked it a third time, west to east, slowly, and looked down every single cross street as I passed. On every one of them, to some degree, the street was wrong, longer or shorter, brighter or dimmer. Some had more streetlights than they should have. Some had fewer. Some had sounds that did not belong to them. One, which I think was either 10th or 11th, had what looked, for just a moment as I passed, like a row of houses on the left side that I was almost certain did not exist during the day. I did not stop to confirm. But Ferris, the whole length of it, was stable. The buildings were where they should have been. The distances between intersections matched what I knew from walking the street in daylight. The diner was where the diner was. The bar was where the bar was. The pharmacy's sign hummed at the frequency I had heard during the day. Ferris, at night, was the only place in Hallen's Reach that was still the place it was during the day. And the residents of Hallen's Reach, all of them, as far as I could tell, knew this, and had known it their entire lives, and had incorporated it into their habits so completely that they could no longer explain it, because explaining it would require them to believe that anywhere else in the world was different, and I am not certain, by the end of my time there, that they did. I want to describe one more thing before I come to the end of this account. In my 6th week, about 10 days before I was scheduled to leave, I saw a man I did not recognize. This was itself notable, because by that point I knew most of the faces in town by sight, even if I did not know all their names. This man was walking on Ferris at about 9 in the evening, heading east. He was perhaps 40, dressed in the kind of clothes a traveler might wear, a canvas jacket, jeans, boots. He was carrying a small duffel bag. He walked with the slightly alert posture of someone new to a place. I watched him from the window of the diner, where I was eating a late dinner. He walked past the diner, continued east, and when he reached the corner of Ferris and Oak, he turned. He turned down Oak. He did not pause. He did not tilt his head. He did not close his eyes. He simply turned the corner, the way a person turns a corner in any other town, and walked south down Oak, his duffel bag swinging slightly at his side. I was the only one in the diner who appeared to notice. Janine was at the counter, and when she saw me watching, she followed my gaze out the window. By then, the man was about half a block down Oak. Janine watched him for perhaps 2 seconds. Then she picked up the coffee pot and walked to the back of the diner to refill a customer's cup. She did not look toward the window again. I stood up and went to the door. I did not open it. I looked east, down Ferris, toward the corner of Oak. The man was no longer visible. I could not see how far down Oak he had gone, because Oak at night was longer than it should have been, and the streetlights receded into a distance that was not the distance of a small town side street. I watched the corner for a long time, perhaps 20 minutes. He did not come back. No one came out of any of the houses on Oak. No lights changed. The sound of Ferris continued around me. Cars, voices, the bell of the pharmacy door. Oak was silent in the way the side streets were silent, which was not silence but a muted, mismatched sound that did not correspond to anything visible. I went back to my seat. I finished my dinner. I paid and walked back to the boarding house on Ferris and went upstairs to my room. In the morning, I walked down Oak. It was an ordinary street, 3 blocks long as it had always been. A small park at the end, as there had always been. Houses with porches and mailboxes and parked cars. I walked the full length of it and back. There was no sign of the man. There was no duffel bag. There were no footprints, though the pavement would not have held footprints anyway. There was no disturbance of any kind. I asked Janine about him the next time I was in the diner. I asked if she remembered the man who had come through the night before. She said, "What man?" I described him. The canvas jacket, the duffel bag, walking east on Ferris. She thought about it for a moment. She said, "I don't remember anyone like that. It was pretty quiet last night." She was not lying. I watched her face. She was telling me what she remembered, which was that the evening had been pretty quiet. I did not ask Corbin. I did not ask Dell. I did not ask Pete. I finished my work in Hallen's Reach. My last survey was on a Friday, a property line on the north edge of town, near but not touching the cemetery. I turned in my final paperwork to Corbin on Monday morning. He stamped it, thanked me, and wished me a safe drive. Dell charged me exactly what she had quoted on the first day. She took down the piece of paper with the number 8 from her refrigerator and threw it away. I left on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks and 1 day after I had arrived. I drove out the way I had come in, up out of the shallow depression the town sat in, past the silo, over the bridge with the faded weight limit. I did not look back, not out of any superstition, simply because there was no reason to. I have thought about Hallen's Reach often in the years since. I have looked it up on maps which show it where it should be, a small grid of streets in a rural county with Ferris Street running through the middle. I have never gone back. I do not intend to. What I think about, when I think about it, is not fear. That is the part I cannot quite explain to people when I have tried, which is rarely. It is not a frightening memory. The town was not frightening. The people were not frightening. Ferris Street at night was, in some ways, the most peaceful street I have ever walked on. Well lit, calm, populated by people who moved slowly and spoke quietly and did not bother each other. What I think about is how completely the residents lived inside the rule, how the rule was not a burden to them, not a restriction, not a source of anxiety. It was simply the shape of their lives. They went to work on all the streets during the day, and they went home on one street at night, and the part of the world that behaved strangely when the sun went down was not something they fought or feared or even acknowledged. It was something they had made an arrangement with long ago, through habits that were now so old that the reasons for them had worn away, leaving only the habits, smooth and functional and unquestioned. I think about the man with the duffel bag. I think about how he turned down Oak without pausing. I think about how Janine did not remember him the next morning, and I believe her, because I think something about the town or about the side streets at night does not leave a full record of the people who do not follow the rule. Not a violent erasure, nothing dramatic, just a softening of their outline, a gradual forgetting until the diner at 9 in the evening becomes a pretty quiet night, and the east end of Ferris becomes a place where no one in particular walked. I think, sometimes, that I was close to understanding something in Hallen's reach, and that I left before I understood it, and that this was the correct decision. I think that the rule is not protecting the residents from what is on the side streets at night. I think the rule is keeping the residents inside the small portion of the town where the world still has the shape they expect. And I think that the side streets are not dangerous in the way a dark alley is dangerous. They are dangerous in the way a place that is not quite a place is dangerous. They are where the town thins out, where the distances stop agreeing with themselves, where the sounds do not match the sights, where a street that should be 3 blocks long is, instead, as long as it needs to be. And I think the residents of Hallen's Reach know this, not in words, not in any way they could explain to me or to each other. They know it the way a person knows not to step off a curb into traffic, the way a person knows not to put a hand on a hot stove. They know it because they have always known it, and because the town they live in has, at some point long before any of them were born, agreed with them about Ferris Street, and about the hours after dark, and about the small tilt of the head at the corner before stepping off onto the street that leads home. I no longer live in that region. I took another job in another state, and then another, and the work has kept me moving. I walk on whatever streets I need to walk on, at whatever hour. I do not pause at corners. I do not listen before I step off the curb. But sometimes, at night, in a town I do not know well, when I am walking on a main road and I pass a side street that is darker than it should be, or quieter than it should be, or when the street lights down it seemed to recede a little further than the length of the block should allow, I find that I have stopped. I find that I am standing at the corner. I find that I am listening, though I do not know what I am listening for. And then, after a few seconds, I keep walking, on the main road, the way I was going, and I do not turn. I do not know if this is something I learned in Hallen's Reach, or if it is something I already knew and only remembered there. I think that may be the same thing.